There's no doubt that a technology architecture such as mBRIDGE limits the ability by which a single country can intervene in the transactions of other countries. And that's one of the main attractive features of a distributed ledger architecture. So, in that sense, there is no doubt in my mind that the ability of the United States to weaponize dollar-based transactions through its ability to influence the operations of SWIFT will be curtailed going forward.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm excited to welcome back Warwick Powell. Warwick is adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology in Australia and a senior fellow at Taihe Institute in Beijing. Warwick is also an expert in all things blockchain and digital technologies, which is the focus of our conversation today. Warwick, welcome back. I'm so happy to see you again.
Great to be here again with you.
CBDC project mBRIDGE has been making headlines in recent months. Blockchain-based mBRIDGE does not support settlements made in US dollars, from what I understand. And this may mean that once completed, it will become the system that will accelerate de-dollarization around the world. Effectively, its goal is to become the basis for a global alternative financial system, the system that will support multipolarity. Warwick, could you start us off by walking us through what Project mBRIDGE is, how it is structured, and who are the key stakeholders?
Sure, let's try and break it down. Project mBridge is a collaborative project involving a number of central banks, together with a larger group of central banks and associated financial regulators from different countries in the world as observers. So the founding partners in the project are the Bank of International Settlements, the Monetary Authority of Hong Kong, and the central banks of China, the UAE, and Thailand. More recently, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia has joined as a full participating member. The way that this project works is that it's actually organized, before we get to the technology part, is that it's organized in effect as a multi-party committee-based governance system, whereby the principal participants have worked together to co-design and progressively test and implement and retest a technology to tackle some long-standing problems in cross-border payment settlements. The problems that they're trying to tackle really go to the costs and the time inefficiencies, together with the risks of censorship that come from the traditional architecture of cross-border settlements. The way that cross-border settlements historically has worked is that the settlement of transactions between organizations in different countries actually takes place through a series of steps. And those steps involve relationships between those organizations and their commercial bank, the commercial bank and its relationship to that country's central bank, and that central bank's relationship to the counterparty central bank, and then back down the architecture to the counterparty organization. So when transactions are being undertaken traditionally, they ultimately have to be settled through central bank to central bank messaging, whereby the ledgers in both of those banks are adjusted accordingly, where the ledger in one central bank is added to and the ledger in the counterparty bank is subtracted from. This process is quite clunky. It is quite slow and is quite expensive. The principal ways that this process has been implemented in recent times has been through what everyone knows as the SWIFT messaging platform. And that enables participating banks to communicate with each other, to send secure messages in accordance with a standard format so that they, in effect, can understand what the instructions are from the other side. This process can take many days for the ledgers to be adjusted, and the fees and charges that are incurred in this process are quite high. So we've got a problem of cost and time. Now, those problems, of course, pre-existed the more recent set of problems. And those recent set of problems have gone to how this particular set of institutions has become weaponized. By weaponized, I mean that they have now become part of a process through which one particular party in particular, namely the United States, has been able to cause the operators of SWIFT to exclude the banks from certain countries or specific banks from being able to exchange messages with others. In other words, kick them out of the key information sharing arrangements that enable cross-border payments to work. mBRIDGE begins to tackle all of these issues. So the way that mBRIDGE does it is that it does it with a distributed ledger or a blockchain. The blockchain architecture is established in two basic layers. The first layer is a layer in which the participating central banks operate nodes, their own computers, which maintain a copy of the ledger. And those nodes also have the authority to be part of the consensus mechanism, which is the way in which this shared ledger is updated. The second layer of this architecture is the layer of the participating commercial banks. Now, those commercial banks also have nodes, and those nodes have a copy of the same ledger. The difference is that the commercial banks don't have the authority to participate in the ledger updates directly. So only the participating central banks actually have the authority to participate in the consensus mechanism that finally settles what the updates are. This distributed infrastructure enables the contemporaneous updating of all accounts. So now we've solved the time problem, because instead of having to wait for messages to be moved from one party to the other and for updates to ledgers to be made, they are made at the same time. In being able to make them at the same time, we also reduce costs. And importantly, because it's a distributed ledger where all the participating central banks are members of the consensus mechanism, no single bank can censor or block or amend transactions. That's the basic design, if you will, and the operations of mBRIDGE to date.
Is Project mBRIDGE focused solely on wholesale CBDCs or e-commerce transactions, or does it have plans to eventually include retail CBDCs?
At this stage, it's very much focused on the bank-to-bank transaction environment. And I guess in that sense, you would say that it is a piece of wholesale transactions architecture. More recently, the owner of WeChat in China, which is a very significant e-commerce and retail payments platform, has participated in a number of technology and transactions trials. In effect, that enables a business-to-business cross-border transaction to take place. But at the back end, if you will, what's going on is that it's the commercial banks through the central banks onto this collective ledger that are actually settling the transactions. So for the experience of the participating enterprises, it is their accounts that are changing, whether it's being added to or having numbers taken away from it. But the mechanism is actually taking place at the bank-to-bank level.
I see. My understanding is that Project mBRIDGE is supported by the IMF, the World Bank, and it is currently being observed by central banks of South Korea, Turkey, and Norway at this time. So there's definitely quite a bit of interest. It seems that those countries may become full participants at some point, just like Saudi Arabia just became a full participant several months ago. A number of large banks such as HSBC and Goldman are participating as well. So there is engagement from central banks as well as from the private sector. What do you feel is driving this unity between the two?
I think they're all looking for a transactions settlements infrastructure that is fast, that is cheap, and that is ultimately censorship resistant. So those three key objectives are the common causes, if you will, for all participating institutions. In addition to those institutions you mentioned, Lena, there's actually more than 20 central banks from around the world involved in the observer level. And I think that speaks volumes to the interest in this particular technology solution to the problems as I described them, and also opens out the scaling pathway. So, about 18 months or so ago, the project team actually executed its first real trials of transactions involving some 150 odd transactions valued at about 25 million US dollars or thereabouts to evaluate where they'd gotten to in terms of the design of their software. Now, that all worked. So, in a sense, they proved at a proof of concept level that the design objectives could be achieved. What the team discovered in doing that was that they needed to do some enhancements to the consensus mechanism of the blockchain itself, which they undertook during the course of 2023 and delivered a significant overhaul to the consensus mechanism, which now drives much faster, lower cost settlements. So, so they did that in readiness really for launching a minimum viable product. Now, for probably the last 6 months or so, there's been a lot of buzz in the industry amongst a narrow group of people, if you will, who are interested in these things, waiting for the launch of this minimum viable product. And that has been done now. So the mBRIDGE project is inviting organizations to make proposals for applications that will interact with their settlements architecture to deliver specific use case solutions for particular kinds of cross-border transactions, needs, and opportunities. So, for instance, most of this architecture has focused, of course, on the settlement of money accounts. But when we're dealing with cross-border transactions, we're also dealing with the movements of goods. So, the ways in which this money settlements architecture interacts with data related to supply chains is likely to be one of the next frontiers that will be addressed not just by mBRIDGE itself, because mBRIDGE has a very narrow remit, but by participating organizations in industry, in technology, and ultimately in the area of trade and supply chains. So this MVP, which is now out, I think opens up the next chapter for mBRIDGE to become more generalized and to reach into the real world of cross-border trade, not just cross-border transactions, but cross-border trade.
When I created a video a couple of weeks ago and I spoke about Saudi Arabia joining Project mBRIDGE, one of the questions that I received was very interesting, and I would like to get your feedback on this question. So, Project mBRIDGE is managed by the Bank for International Settlements, and it is supported by the IMF and World Bank, as we just discussed. And so, it is truly somewhat confusing because given that mBRIDGE does not support the dollar, it seems almost counterintuitive for Western-led entities to support its development. What is your take on that?
Look, I think that there is a realization by organizations around the world when they take a step back from the geopolitics of all of this, that the prevailing institutions and technologies that have supported cross-border transactions over the last 70 years are really reaching the end of their use-by date. And I mean by that the realization that these systems and institutions are expensive, they take more time than they really should, And of course, more recently, they've become prone to censorship or weaponization. So all of these factors are coming together where somebody who is relatively neutral in all of this, but is simply interested in a technology and a governance regime that enables confidence and predictability in ledger adjustments across borders, they're all looking for better ways of doing this. And distributed ledger technologies, supported by well-established mature institutions in countries as well as cross-border institutions like the BIS, hold a lot of potential to meeting these ambitions and goals.
How important will Project mBRIDGE become for de-dollarization? What role do you expect it to play?
Look, the project could play a very important role, either directly or indirectly. Directly, of course, as a piece of infrastructure itself, it could certainly facilitate national currency-based trade settlements that don't involve the exchange of national currencies into US dollars and then the exchange of US dollars back into national currencies as the way in which trade settlements are made. The other way in which I think it can play a very important role is the learnings that have come from the development of mBRIDGE as a project itself. The learnings in terms of the technology design and also in terms of the non-technological aspects of governing a consensus-based network of organizations. Now, those learnings, I think, are going to play an important role ultimately in the way in which BRICS is going to see its own national currency-based trade settlement system unfold. So there's no doubt in my mind that the work that has been done in mBRIDGE is going to play a critical role in the processes of currency multipolarity as that unfolds over the next, well, 5 to 10 years.
And that brings us into a really interesting topic that I think our viewers would love to hear about. mBRIDGE is an alternative to SWIFT, as you just mentioned. What does mBRIDGE mean for the United States foreign policy in terms of its ability to wage economic warfare and to target non-aligned governments? Is that going to considerably take away that ability? Or do you think that eventually, with the evolution of the payment systems and multipolar world order and multi-currency transactions, is there going to be a work around this particular system that would allow countries to still effectively exercise the right to limit the use of their currencies, even within the system?
There's no doubt that a technology architecture such as mBRIDGE limits the ability by which a single country can intervene in the transactions of other countries. And that's one of the main attractive features of a distributed ledger architecture. So in that sense, there is no doubt in my mind that the ability of the United States to weaponize dollar-based transactions through its ability to influence the operations of SWIFT will be curtailed going forward. Now, this has already been happening for a number of years, of course, well before mBRIDGE was first designed and developed. Countries like China, countries like Russia have been working on independent bank-to-bank messaging systems separate to SWIFT to enable their institutions to message each other in a reliable and secure way so that the ledgers in those institutions can be adjusted accordingly. Now, those interbank messaging systems that have been developed since really 2014, 2015 have already been playing important roles over the last 2 years as the world, particularly in terms of cross-border trade, has explored and ultimately implemented de-dollarization. And a classic case in point, of course, is the ways in which the trade between China and Russia have been settled. these days, about 95% of Russia's trade is settled in anything but the US dollar and the euro. And that goes for its trade with China as well. Much of that trade with China is settled in RMB, though a substantial portion of that is also settled in the ruble. We're also seeing that happen in terms of Russia's trade with India and India's trade with the UAE, where India and the UAE are trading with national currencies. So this network of national currency-based trade settlements is starting to gain momentum. It's certainly secured a foothold by virtue of the trade between Russia and China. And what that shows is that it's possible and that it can be done relatively quickly. For a lot of people, the idea of migrating away from a US dollar based or dominated trade settlement system was actually inconceivable even 3 years ago. It was a very, very slow process of evolution. But quite clearly, when there is a pressing need, as there has been since the Ukraine conflict took on its current turn in early 2022 and the sanctions on Russia were imposed, the change can happen incredibly fast. So the adaptive ability of organizations, enterprises, and banks, given existing technologies, to go to new systems of cross-border settlements is really there for all of us to see.
We just mentioned that Saudi Arabia was the latest country to become a full member of the project. What is your take on the significance of the Saudis participating, and what impact do you feel it will have on crude oil settlements?
Look, it's a significant development. One of the main reasons that countries around the world held significant dollar reserves historically has been to ensure that they're in a position to settle their oil purchasing requirements. The fact that Saudi Arabia is participating in a settlements architecture that enables national currency-based settlements, I think, is an important development in the evolution of global settlement systems. I think what we're starting to see is the settlements architecture catching up with what's going on in the real economy. So over the last 10 years or so, the trading relationships between Saudi Arabia and China, for example, has been growing substantially. And there is, in fact, no real reason why the trading relationship between entities in these two countries needs to be mediated by the currency of a third party. And so we're starting to see the use of national currencies as part of the trade settlements between enterprises in Saudi Arabia and those in China. So the underlying economic realities of value flows, oil and energy from Saudi Arabia to China, and electronics and other capital goods from China to Saudi Arabia, have reached a volume where there is a lot of upside in terms of time saved and money saved, as well as reduced risk in terms of foreign exchange volatility for these two countries to be trading directly with each other. So moving into mBRIDGE, I think, is a reflection of that fundamental reality. And it perhaps also suggests that the Saudi Arabia Central Bank understands the importance of being part of a governance architecture that delivers a censorship-resistant settlement system. So it's important to be involved in and contributing to the integrity of that system, as opposed to simply sitting on the sidelines and using it when you need.
So given that Saudi Arabia is the biggest oil exporter and China, due to its massive manufacturing capacity, is the top crude oil importer, is it fair to say that mBRIDGE might be a pathway to a petro yuan?
Look, mBRIDGE is a settlements mechanism, if you will. It's a way in which we can have ledgers adjust simultaneously and in a low cost way. Now, once you can do that, then the ability to denominate the value of commodities in different currencies becomes quicker and easier to do. So we're starting to reduce transaction costs. And once you do that, then there is no reason why you won't start to see in the world a situation where the value of various commodities, including crude oil, will be denominated in currencies other than the United States dollar. The Shanghai Oil and Gas Exchange is probably one of the least appreciated but critical institutional features of this currency multipolarity landscape. And that's because that exchange enables the buying and selling of oil and gas valued in RMB. And you might recall that when China's President Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia, must be almost 20 months ago, amongst the range of things that were announced was actually a commitment to progressively grow the amount of oil products from Saudi Arabia that would be traded on that particular exchange. So institutionally, the architecture's in place. Technology-wise, there are existing technologies for messaging, but there are new technologies such as mBRIDGE, which will facilitate an even smoother, lower cost transaction settlement. And the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, if you will, are well and truly in place now for this transition to currency multipolarity as the foundation of international economic interaction.
If we could focus a bit more on currency multipolarity, I know that our viewers hear that quite a bit, especially recently, probably these past 6 months. I think it's been reported by multiple independent journalists and certainly many YouTubers. Many people think that multipolarity in terms of currency and in terms of the sort of power distribution in the world, somehow they view it as as a way to oppose directly Western power or the United States. Whereas what it really is a way for countries around the world to really focus on their own development, to reestablish an order that works for them and in their favor. So maybe could you walk us through currency multipolarity and what it would mean for economies worldwide, for developing or emerging markets, I should say, and how they expect it to benefit them 5 years from now?
Yeah, focus on national currencies really is about emphasizing national economic sovereignty in large part. The reality is that most economies in the world are actually predominantly domestic in orientation, with their trade exposure contributing to varying extents a relatively small proportion of their overall economic activity. The other dimension, of course, relates to this issue of capital flows from an investment point of view. And that is often, particularly for developing countries, not so much equity-based capital injections, but debt-based capital injections. So the developing world has historically borrowed funds from institutions like the IMF to enable economic development to be pursued. That's the economic theory anyway. Now, when that has happened, those debts that they incur are denominated in US dollars. So to settle those debts, they need to have US dollars. So the question becomes, how do these countries' central banks accumulate US dollars? One way is to sell things that they have to the United States or to other parties denominated in US dollars as a way of getting US dollars to enable them ultimately to settle their debts to the IMF, or increasingly to private lenders, through privately issued uh, 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 funds, private bonds to settle those debts in US dollars. So what does that mean? Well, it means that what you produce in your country and the amount of US dollars that you can get for it is subject to forces that you don't control. So if the relative value of your produce denominated in domestic currencies changes relative to the US dollar's value, you could end up in a situation where you have to exchange a lot more of what you produce for a lot less US dollars, which puts you on the back foot in terms of your ability to settle your loans. Now, the next challenge comes when those loans incur interest, as they do, and settling those interest requirements also demands US dollars. The interest that is charged on many of those loans is affected by the interest rates on US dollars that arises as a result of US monetary policy. So when the cost of your borrowings as a developing nation goes up because of US monetary policy, again, something that you have no control over, you are further exposed to the need to exchange even more of your physical produce for a given amount of US dollars so that you can settle the debts that you have. The risk in this is that it creates an economic spiral where the developing country actually can never accumulate sufficient US dollars to meet its loan obligations. And we see that happen time and time again. And in fact, we've seen that happen over and over for the past 50 years. What happens as a result is that the developing countries have to refinance through the IMF. The IMF imposes a range of conditions that often requires the countries to implement policies that involve selling down assets, national assets, so that they can accumulate US dollars to pay the loans, and to impose austerity on their populations because the lender ranks higher in the order of priority than everyone else. None of this actually contributes to economic development. The move to currency multipolarity hopefully allows nations to break free from this spiral risk and focus on their own economic development without exposure to exchange rate volatility and exposure to the whims of American monetary policy. So these are kind of boring and technical discussions, but really they go to the heart of whether a country has the ability to develop its own productive capacity, and to do so that gets itself out of its state of underdevelopment without being trapped in a range of debt obligations that they simply can't service.
And one thing that attracts developing countries to the BRICS and to alternative ways to get financing is the fact that nowadays geopolitical tensions really make them worried, and they're worried that they may not be able to remain aligned or remain in a position that is acceptable to the United States, right? And so if they choose to pursue their own interests, if they choose to lean one way or another, that is not approved by this party, the United States, then they may really pay twice, right? They may end up not being able to develop economically. They may not be able to, they may effectively face really severe constraints, even domestic instability as the result of those. So they're really motivated to move away from the system that is seen as extremely risky and move towards the alternative system, which mBRIDGE is expected to be supportive of.
Yeah, look, BRICS, I think, has a number of really interesting attributes, if you will, and why that makes it attractive to many developing nations. Often, Western observers criticize BRICS for being incoherent and lacking this sort of sense of common purpose. It talks about the diversity of all the member countries and how they have their differences of opinions and differences amongst each other. But that's actually why BRICS is strong. BRICS actually doesn't have a particularly, what I guess I would call a very thick moralizing approach to how countries come together. There isn't a single party that seeks to dictate particular terms around domestic issues, and it supports the ability for participating member countries to interact with each other as sovereign nations and to pursue economic development and social development on its own terms. The BRICS Bank, the new development bank, is also moving down the path of further supporting national sovereignty through the issuance of credit in national currencies. Now, the BRICS Bank at the moment has about 75% of its loans denominated in US dollars and 25% in national currencies, with a plan that over the next 3 years for the proportion of national currency denominated financing to grow to over 30%. Now, this is a significant move. You sort of think, well, 25% to over 30% doesn't sound like a lot. But when the total value of the loan book grows and the financing balance sheet grows, these shifts in percentages represent very major evolutions in the composition of the denomination of the financial instruments concerned. So we're going to see enterprises and governments in different parts of the world through their membership of BRICS to be able to access development finance denominated in their own national currencies. And that deals with the problems that I described earlier. You're not going to be exposed to currency exchange volatility problems. You're not going to be exposed to the challenges that could be imposed upon you as a result of US domestic monetary policy. And ultimately, it also means that your interactions with each other, particularly as institutions or technologies like mBRIDGE roll out, you won't be exposed to an institutional and technical architecture that enables one party to capriciously censor or in some other way intervene in your dealings with others. All of this makes institutions like BRICS actually incredibly effective and attractive to countries around the world. And we're seeing that with the amount of interest expressed towards participating in BRICS from countries in Africa, Asia, South America, etc.